By the way, Brian is our Connectome coordinator, so he's the main person behind all this in the NeuroTechX space. Okay, so hello everyone, hello everyone. People are going to be joining, but like I think we're going to start because the time of the webinar is 1 hour, and then we want to make benefit of the most of this. I must say it's now streaming live on YouTube as well. So if anybody is watching this there, feel free to put some questions. And then here the chat is more close and less formal, let's say. So whenever you feel like saying anything, just raise your hand or hop in the chat, and I can give you the mic to speak. So for you who are like new in this series, this is a series that we started around a month ago. It's a NeurotechX online event series. It's open-ended, aimed mainly at hosting guests working at the intersection of neuroscience with all these things, but mainly neurotechnology as being part of NeuroTechX. And then following my interest mainly in design and architecture and urban design, we're making a mash within all this. So today our guest is Dr. Emma, who's going to be talking mainly, I suppose, about cognitive sciences and the urban scale of urban design, following her collective that she's leading at the moment as City. So I think we're going to tell us more about that as well. And that was my first interface with like getting to know you as well. And then without taking much time on this, Emma, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you, Firas. I'm going to share my screen.
Sure.
Please do not hesitate to tell me if you don't see my full screen, because sometimes we may have surprises.
Oh, we see it. It's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself and the team at City that Firas briefly introduced already. So I'm Emma Vilarem. I have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience, and I'm leading a collective called City, based in Paris, with 3 colleagues, and our mission is to apply behavioral and brain research in order to create urban environments that better address individuals' cognitive, emotional, and social needs. And at City, we are 3 people coming from the field of cognitive science and behavioral science. So we have an expertise in studying human behavior, and an urbanist who's our cities expert in the team. And I'm going to briefly present the framework we're working in before explaining a bit more precisely what we do within this framework. But just to let you understand why we do this, I'm going to show you some results that prove the importance of looking at human behavior and its relationship with urban environments. So what science can teach us about urban life? That's the question we're trying to address every day in the team. As you know, the urban share of the population is increasing more and more, and has overcame the rural population lately. And the question we're trying to address in the team is, what are the consequences of urban living on human behavior? And now there are plenty of data showing that even though cities are what we call lands of opportunities, because they are the nexus of human exchanges, they are the places where things happen, where people meet, get educated, work, live, they are also lands of angst and deprivation, with data showing here on the graph that depending on the age of arrival in the city, your risk of developing a pathology such as schizophrenia increases with the earliest you arrive in the city, the bigger the risk. And the risk is increased if you're living or if you have grown up in a capital center compared to other types of urban environments. And there are studies showing that current city dwellers have a substantially increased risk for anxiety disorders by 21%, mood disorders by 39%, and schizophrenia by 50%. I will discuss the mechanisms a bit later, but I will go on pointing out some stressors that might be responsible for the decline in mental health that we can observe in urban dwellers. First, one of these stressors is the different types of pollution we're exposed to: air pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, with effect on cognitive developments, with studies showing, for example, that if you're living in an environment that is exposed to noise at night, so here it's studies on children, the greater the level of sound at night, the bigger the difficulties in school for the children, with the study showing the performance in typical tests, including perceptual tests like discriminating different shapes, for instance, cognitive tests like estimating and comparing quantities, and motor tasks such as asking children to jump on one leg or to walk on a straight line. And what's highlighted in those studies is that children perform better at school when they are exposed to a lesser level of noise at night, and the bigger the sound level, or the higher the sound level, the bigger the difficulties on perceptual, cognitive, and motor abilities in children. Another type of stressor that is responsible or might be responsible for mental health decline in cities is the social stress and isolation that is paradoxical in cities. So we are living in dense urban environments, but there are studies showing that the social isolation is greater in cities because there's a sense of anonymity in cities that we don't find in rural areas or in the peri-urban centers. And there are studies showing that the regions of the brain that are recruited when we perceive threat and when we have a negative affect, that the activation of those brain regions is correlated to the density of the city people are living in, with studies showing that if you're living in a city that is over 100,000 inhabitants, the level of activation of the amygdala, which is a brain region that is specialized in the threat processing, is more activated than when you live in less dense areas. And studies showing that the region in charge of stress regulation are more active if you have grown up in denser urban environments, with the idea that when you live in cities, there's a sense of social stress or social threat or social competition that is increased compared to other urban environments. A third type of stressors that might be responsible for the mental health decline in cities is the urban lifestyle, and the idea that urban environments are environments that are not within which our brain has not adapted. So, for instance, there are lots of studies showing that if you compare the cognitive performance of an individual before and after a 90-minute walk, if this walk is in a park, is cognitive performance increase after the walk in the park, meaning that the being exposed to a natural environment might be beneficial for the brain functioning, whereas the same walk duration, but in the city, do not increase the cognitive performance after the walk, with the idea that urban environments, they are so demanding that they can deprive our cognitive resources. And finally, one of the last stressors I wanted to point out today is the poor housing. So could be either the quality of, for instance, insulation in your apartment, or exposure to natural light, but also the location of your housing, with a lot of studies showing now that socioeconomic inequalities can impact greatly cognitive development and cognitive functioning. And I was mentioning the beneficial impact of exposure to nature on cognitive performance, but there are plenty of data now showing that exposure to a natural environment increases well-being, increases social life, decreases rumination of negative emotion, and so on. And there are socioeconomic inequalities showing that the least deprived neighborhood, on a socioeconomic point of view, the least deprived neighborhood are often closer to green spaces than the most deprived neighborhood. So socioeconomic inequalities can lead to greater, in a sense, cognitive inequalities, because those populations are already fragile, living in vulnerable housing conditions, and they are also further from spaces that can benefit their mental health. And the question you might be wondering or asking yourself is, why do we observe this detrimental effect of air, light, noise pollution, social stress, urban lifestyle, or poor housing? Because the hypothesis is that our brain has evolved in different ecological and social environments for millions of years, and it's not adapted yet to our urban way of life that is more recent in human evolution, which can alter its functioning. So the idea is that we used to live in a more natural environment with a different social life. We used to have local social resources to live near our close ones. And now in cities, we are less exposed to nature and less with the increase in density. So we are less exposed to nature, and nature is further and further away. And we tend to be disseminated in cities and not to have our local social networks around the place where we live or where we work. And there are studies supporting this hypothesis, showing that, for instance, if you have grown up in a green residential environment, you have a decreased risk of developing psychiatric disorders. And those graphs show that the more your place of residence is surrounded by nature with this NDVI decile, so the greater the number, the denser the vegetation around your place of residence, the lesser the number, the sparser the vegetation around your place of residence. And those studies show that if you have grown up in a residential environment that is enriched in nature, you have a decreased risk to develop pathologies such as schizophrenia, but a lot of other psychiatric disorders. And those studies are really robust, and those effects can be shown either at the rural level, provincial town level, and even in capital centers. And what do we do in city with those data? I'm going to present briefly 4 types of missions that we conduct, and I will leave room for the questions. And if you need details, please do not hesitate to ask them in the chat or afterwards. So what do we do with those data? First, we have a mission to assist the development of urban projects. So what we do is that we collect data on the site, for instance. So here on the screen, it's one project we are conducting since 2019. It's a project where they are opening a public space in a site that was closed to the public for decades, and a space that is really a site that is really rich in nature, with water coming by, with a lot of vegetation, with very ancient and beautiful buildings, as you can see on the picture on the left. And we were solicited by the client in order to better understand what is beneficial in this environment for the human functioning and for the human behavior, in order to be sure to preserve those qualities in the future neighborhood. So we collected data on the site, and we provided evidence-based recommendation for the future urban project, showing, for instance, that in some parts of the site, the access to natural light was particularly important for well-being, for instance, and we translated then those scientific recommendations into urban and architectural recommendation with the help of Alice, who's the urbanist in the team. So we can really contribute to the project development by providing evidence-based recommendation, either through data collection in situ, so on the site, or if it's not possible, for instance, if it's a neighborhood to be built and there's nothing at the day, we dig into the scientific literature in order to make evidence-based recommendations. What we can do also is to measure the behavioral or cognitive or emotional or perceptual impact of an urban project. So here you have an example showing an artistic urban project that was realized in Paris in 2019. And we were called to assess the impact on the people living in the neighborhood and familiar to the site. And as you see, the site used to be a very gray and dark and lonely environment, and they turned it into a very colorful and playful environment. And what we have assessed on the site is that putting art in the city increases positive emotions, decreases negative emotions, increases the sense of attachment to the place and the willingness of protecting the place. So we were called in order to really prove the added value of introducing art in the cities. Another type of mission that we do is that we conduct what we call behavioral diagnosis. So the difference with the impact assessment is that it's just a one-shot field study, and we investigate human behavior in order to better understand the relationship to the urban environment. So for instance, we can study how people behave in crowded urban environments, how people orient themselves in train station, how people orient themselves in the street, for instance. And now, and on those types of mission, we can also record physiological data. So as you can see on the right, there's a picture with a wireless like a watch device that records what's called electrodermal activity, which is a proxy for emotional arousal or stress. So this type of data can be used in addition to other types of data and help us make sense and understanding human behavior in freely moving participants. So they just wear the device, and then we analyze the data and we provide results to the client. And we can also record what's called the oculomotor activity, so studying the gaze pattern in an urban environment, for instance. And finally, what we do is what I'm doing today. We give conferences and workshops in order to raise awareness and to take into account the functioning of the brain and human behavior in urban projects, because it's still an emerging field. And I thank Firas to have invited me, because we need to talk more and more about those intersectional projects, because I truly believe that we are going to make a successful urban project by integrating different expertises around the table, from architecture to urbanism to landscape design and to sciences like cognitive sciences. And I thank you for your attention. I was a bit quick, so please, you have plenty of time for questions. Feel free to ask.
Yeah, well, I have as well a lot of questions too, and a lot of topics to be discussing. And thanks a lot, Emma, for this presentation. I think that was like a great introduction for things to talk about afterwards. So the first very obvious question is, you work simultaneously with a background from neuroscience or cognitive sciences, to be more specific, and urban design. So can you tell us more about how does this collaboration, I mean, how does the work, which is quite much interdisciplinary happen between people from these different two backgrounds. And then if you can tell us a bit more about like the workflow or the methodology of integrating these two expertise.
Yes. So first, the collaboration is both easy and uneasy, I would say. So in France, actually, it's quite still difficult to cross silos and to work with the very different expertise than yours. So I wasn't trained. I was trained in an academia and studying human brain in the lab. So very, very conventional context. So I had to unlearn a lot of things and to learn a lot of new things in order to be able to either just share the same vocabulary that other fields of expertise. And once you have met people who are open to including other way of looking at urban projects, for instance, it's quite easy because we don't take the place of anybody. We're just proposing to add another way to look at the problem or to look at the solution, if you wish.
Yeah, actually, this was something I was like as well having as an argument most of the times where like having this new hybrid model of neurotechnology or neuroscience and design is more. I mean, it's less finding value and more creating value. So we're quite much doing this. So maybe we can talk a bit next because you have expertise in labs and outside labs as well. So maybe you can tell us more about how neurotechnologies are different in the lab and outside the lab. What are the differences and how can we work with that? Because now within the neurotech community, we all quite know like what's been happening in the last years with all this, let's say, democratization of neurotechnology. A lot of wearables are becoming cheaper and cheaper. We have a lot of things like the EDA or the EEG devices, which are becoming as well more accessible. So I think this makes quite a shift with working with this, especially from people who are not neuroscientists. So maybe you can tell us more about that.
Yes, I would say that those devices are not at all the type of devices we're working with in the lab, because in the lab we're studying human behavior, but in very, very controlled context. So people are coming to the lab, we sit them into an insulated room, they don't move anymore, and then we just look at their behavior. And usually we don't use those wearable devices because we can use like more refined devices because they are stable ones. So we don't need to have miniature devices. We can use like the big EEG and the big electrodermal activity recording machine and so on. So but devices are getting more and more refined. The one we are using for electrodermal activity I was showing on the slide is quite sensitive and is used in patients, for instance, with very good evidence of very good quality. But then once you have a device that is of good quality, there's another interrogation that how are we going to understand the data it provides in the real world? Because that's what we are trying to do. And that's a big challenge, I would say. The bigger risk for me would be to think that those devices the data they provide can be really, really easily understood without any further treatment, data processing, and it's going to give a lot of answers right away, because we know that, for instance, electrodermal activities, for instance, there are 20% of people that don't show any modulation of the signal. So first, you just have to find people who show those modulation. And then we know that it's sensitive to the level of noise, to how stressed you are, to what you're doing, to the motor effort. So those data are quite noisy. And that's a challenge to analyze this data, either on the oculomotor activity or on the electrodermal activity. But I am convinced that it's worth doing it because it's the real world, and what we want to study at CT is how humans are behaving when they can freely move and do everyday tasks. So I would say that those devices are getting really more and more refined, but they still need to be very carefully manipulated and used with a lot of caution, I would say. But that's the former scientist who's speaking. And I've seen projects run with those kind of devices, and at the end of the day, they don't manage to really show really convincing outputs because they underestimated the need to really process the data and really understand what you're recording. So I would say that it's great that those devices are appearing more and more, but caution must be used when manipulating them.
Great. So one thing which is like very central to the work that you're doing and like this kind of work, and then this is something you mentioned within the presentation. So you mentioned the idea of translating data. So you translate findings into recommendations. So this might be like a missing link for a lot of people. So maybe you can tell us more about that as well.
Yes, and actually, I have to admit that it was quite of an interrogation when we started the team, and we were really wondering that if this translation would be effective and would be like really working. But now, with the little bit of experience that we have, I can really say that there's a very big added value to combine expertise. And for instance, I was talking about a project where they are opening a site to the public and making it a public space. And so what we did on this project precisely is that we brought participants and we collected data, so asking them to either participate to cognitive tasks that we were running on the site, but also to questionnaires through scientifically valid questionnaires, asking them different questions about their perception of the built environment. And then we ran analysis that allowed us to understand what were, for instance, the characteristics of the built environment that were impacted the most, the feeling of well-being, for instance. And then with all those results, so for instance, you see that on some part of the site, access to natural light is very, very important and is lacking. And it's this lack of natural light that has the biggest weight on human well-being compared to, for instance, the height of the building or the presence of vegetation. So through statistical analysis, we're able to compare the weight of different characteristics on human well-being, for instance. And then what does it mean for the project? And Alice in the team, she take those scientific outputs, and then she translate them into, for instance, urban recommendation, meaning that so if we are talking about the artificial light, it's easy it's easy to imagine what kind of recommendation we would do for instance, the choice of different materials that can diffuse light, or the height of the building, or I don't know the word in English, but the being able to see the sky through in between buildings. So working on the implementation of the building in order to keep a visual access to the sky. And so she really translated the scientific output into urban and architectural recommendations for the project, and really at the end producing maps that are really common in urban design and that really look like normal in the way normal urban planning, but that was fed with our scientific output.
Yeah, actually, great. Because I actually just reminded me of something. I was on a plane some days ago and I watched a movie where the movie is called The Sound of Silence or something like this. So it's a guy who tunes houses, and then he has a map of Manhattan on his wall, and then he has coded all the city with the pitches and the notes. So he has like, this block is G minor, this block is flat E, whatever. Yeah, and then he has like a coding for the whole city on an urban map, and then it's a really nice visualization of somebody who's coming from a sound theory background, or in this case, cognitive science background, and then doing urban design work.
Yes,
I mean,
I really believe that you can find really different urban recommendation by looking at behavior, because still, for instance, about the noise, you can now have like noise study that tell you the exact level of decibels in different part of a site, for instance, but still the human perception, the noise comfort, the noise, the subjective noise level will be completely different. And for instance, you can see in the literature that the auditive systems interact with the visual systems, and that when you see trees, for instance, you have an impression of noise that is decreased compared with that when you don't see trees. So it's really interesting to do those objective noise study. For sure, it's really important, but to add a subjective layer that can inform about that can really be informative, and that can really add something to the way you're going to design the neighborhood or the buildings and so on.
great. Because the other thing that actually, because I mean, I'm interested in the same things, obviously, and that's why we're talking. But one thing that I think is really challenging is because neurotechnology and neuroscience is a science, and then it's evidence-based and experiment-based. I think this gives a lot of power for people working in design in order to be able to create these recommendations, or let's call them, I mean, just finding all these things and then giving them to people in policy making. So neurotechnology can be a really important instrument in these experiments, be it for cognitive scientists or for architects or designers, to generate this content. And then this could be really important content for like a foundational base for new policy making. Because I mean, you work in Paris, and then we all know the last plan for the 10-minute or 15-minute city, and then all the things that are happening in Paris. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about how the process like runs from an interdisciplinary process of cognitive scientists and urban designers going into recommendations, and then from policy making, and then if you see that as a challenge or something to change in the future.
Yes, it's really interesting. I think that more and more in France, actually, the policymakers are interested by introducing what they call the behavioral sciences in general into the public policy design. So I think that's really something that is booming now, and that's really relevant to do it. We don't use really neurotechnology I mean, for now, the studies we're running for the government, for instance, are studies aiming at understanding human behavior, but really we haven't used neurotechnology in the sense of like devices and so on, but we are studying human behavior by meeting a lot of different, for example, professionals, and interviewing them. And what we do and why it's still cognitive science is that first we dig up the scientific literature in order to make hypotheses about the cognitive and emotional or behavioral drivers that are going to be interesting. For instance, we are now working with the government on the how and why people choose to live in what we call the pavillon, in single houses instead of living in collective housing, for instance. Mm-hmm. And we are studying that using the scientific literature in order to make predictions about why people choose to go further away the city center and live alone. So you have already a lot of hypotheses that are out there. Sociology has worked a lot on those data, but still we are able to make new hypotheses and to test them by meeting with people living in those areas, and people and architects proposing those types of housing, and politicians asking those kind of housing projects and so on. So we don't use neurotechnologies per se for now in those kind of studies, but still we're we're making the most out of the scientific literature in order to make hypotheses and to test them on the field. And then the results can really inform policy making, public policy making, because the idea is then to know how to better communicate to the citizens and how to imply and how to implement public policy. I've lost you.
Sorry?
Yes.
I think we were cut.
Okay. Yes, I don't know where I was or where you lost me, but I was saying that I think it's really interesting for public policy making to study human behavior, because the goal is to have public policies that are designed for the citizens and that are going to be well applied and well understood and well received and so on. So it's really interesting to integrate the scientific literature on human behavior when designing public policies. And using neurotechnology when relevant, when necessary.
And then, because the one thing that is super interesting is that, for example, I come from a more architecture background, but I work in urban design as well. One thing that's really interesting is that it always seems that the architectural scale is more close to the human scale than the urban scale. And then when we start to work with cognitive sciences, it becomes really interesting, because at the end, the scale is one. So mainly working on the brain or on the nervous system or on the person, whatever it is, there's always this like misfit or shift between the scale that we're working on and then the scale that we're studying the impact on. So we're working on neuroscience or neurotechnology and architecture, which sounds, I mean, quite close, because you have like a person and the room or a house or whatever, so you can imagine it an easier thing to do. But in fact, I mean, there's a lot of factors within the urban environment that could be studied as well. And then sometimes this will ask for expanding a bit what neuroscience does, because as you were saying, for example, neurologists work more in controlled environments and labs, but a lot of projects now, such as the ecological brain projects, are just grabbing neuroscience outside the clinic or the lab and then putting it in real life situations in order to be able to ask new questions, mainly for neuroscientists. So how could we evaluate the brain or nervous data or like neural data or stuff like this within real world environments? So I'm really interested as an architect in what could be called like a brain-computer interface at the architectural scale. So creating environments that communicate directly from the brain. You showed in the presentation some things which are mainly working with one of the oldest parts of the brain. And then you were mentioning some things such as the greenery and vegetation. And then it seems like we're designing for our old brains, not for our new brains.
I mean, that we should.
So, like, why should we do that? That's the question.
Why should we design for our old brain rather than for our new brain, as you call it?
Yeah, or as well.
Yes, I think that we like urban extension has been really like fast, and the growing of urban environment has been really like speedy in the last decades. But our brain is the rate of adaptation of our brain is really slow. So we still have the brain we used to have millions of years ago. It's not, our brain is not evolving and adapting in real at the rate of decades. So it's still functioning in a way that it used to function millions of years ago. So the idea is that our brain has evolved in environments and is adapted to process those environments, and it can process them better and more easily than urban environments that we're evolving in nowadays. So the rate of adaptation of our brain is really slow. That's why we're living in environments, our urban environments have changed really quicker and our brain is not adapted yet. We don't know, maybe in hundreds of years it will be adapted to those environments, but today it's not. And when you're out on the street and there are lights catching your attention, and you have to find you have to navigate yourself into the environment, and there's somebody crossing the road, and there's a car, and that's a lot of information for our brain, and it's not used to process all those kind of data that can deprive its resources. And that's why being in more natural environments, so if I go into more details, it's thought that, for instance, our attention, it's driven by two kind of drivers. So we have what we call the exogenous attention that is caught by the environment, and we have an endogenous attention that is driven through our will. And when we are out in the street, either so when we are usually going somewhere, so our endogenous attention is drawn to the environment, but it's also all the time caught by the environment through light, through lighting and noise and so on. So our resources are really, really challenged, and urban environments are really demanding for our brain. Whereas if you're in a natural environment, usually your attention is not solicited and not challenged as much as in urban environments. That's why we see beneficial aspect of exposure to nature on, for instance, attentional performance, because your brain is restored in a way. It has this restoration process going on in nature. And that's why when we want to feel better and to feel more relaxed, we used to go into natural environment and not into urban and crazy, noisy environments.
Unless you're drunk. So, I'm really interested in this topic because this is one of the reasons. There's another topic that has been starting to gain track, let's say, in urban design, which is more being able to work selectively on everything that stimulates the brain. So it's more like selective stimulation on the urban scale. So this means not everybody needs to see everything all the time, because a person who is walking doesn't need to see like some stoplight for a car 2 streets away, or something like this. So, this idea of selective stimulation in the urban scale is something that is really, really interesting for me personally. But then this opens a lot of doors for an interaction between the virtual and the real. Let's call it like this. So I'm talking things about like virtual reality or augmented reality. There's some architectural practices and urban design practices that are quite well known, working on hybrid models for urban design. So you can walk in a space, and then you can project on this reality things that can impact you and impact your neural data and neural activity in a positive way. So while walking in a street, we can add trees only using VR goggles, or AR goggles. So a person who's walking would see just more trees in the goggles, trees that don't exist in reality. This will give, hopefully, positive neural impact. But then this doesn't change really the urban environment. So I think there's a lot of things to explore there.
Yes, I think that it's not to be used for the everyday use, because first, those goggles are quite expensive and are ecologically problematic, I guess. But it's a very interesting tool to study how we would, what can we do to better design urban environments. Now there are a lot more and more studies recreating those urban streetscapes with in order to study what kind of environments have the most beneficial impact on well-being or sense of attachment, or a lot of different variables. And I think it's a great tool to understand how we can do better. I'm not sure it's a solution per se, but it's a great tool to study how we can do better, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I'm just trying to process some things, because one thing as well that we can talk about, I think, is very relevant in all these kind of works, is trying to quantify almost experience. So what you're trying to do is to put in numbers something that is, let's call it, immaterial. So a lot of the times we're working with, I mean, something that we can call neurometrics. So we're working in metrics that are directly related to our neural health or well-being or mental health and stuff and so on and so forth. And to use that, we're using a lot of scientific methods. And then, as you said, sometimes if that's not available, you dig in the literature and then you come up with what other people has worked on already. So, I mean, this interaction between like this objective thing that we project on these findings and the objective metrics that we work upon. What are metrics that you find super important in urban environments? Because I've worked in architectural metrics, and then, for example, in architecture, things that can be super relevant, and there's a lot of people working on this, things like curvature within space, the color of the walls of the environment, the amount of noise, the ceiling height and stuff, so on and so forth. So all these metrics, which are mainly properties of the space itself, become like neural indicators for how good the person would feel in this space. So how can that like translate into urban scale?
Yes, but that's the kind of indicators we're using as well, actually. So now there are lots of, for instance, lots of characteristics of the built environment that are related to how well people will feel and behave in space. So you've cited some of them, like the presence of natural light, the visual access to the sky, the presence of water, the level of the noise, being able to see the horizon, the architectural variety in the environment, the age of the buildings. All those characteristics there are a lot of studies showing that they really impact the way people behave in space. So we're using those kind of data as well, and depending on the project, we are selecting the ones that are the most relevant, because there are some of these, for instance, the height of the building will have a strong impact on the feelings of oppression, or on the feelings of safety. But in other projects, other metrics will be more relevant, and we are adapting the metrics depending on the question we want to address. But still, we're using properties of the built environment and the natural environment as proxies for mental health, for well-being, and so on.
Exactly. So then, because each one of us, I mean, we all know that we all like experience things a bit differently, although we have like a common, let's say, ground, but like everybody experiences things differently. And then with a lot of what's happening now, there's a topic that is as well becoming more and more popular, which is neurodiversity within the urban environment. So we're seeing a lot of times that urban designers have a big challenge, which is to design an urban space which can be used by a lot of people. So we want urban environment that can be used by kids, teenagers, people who are a bit older, and then the elderly as well. So I mean, a lot of techniques and tools are being used. Techniques such as like urban companions, which are like either animals, robotics, or people. But then this thing of creating an urban environment for a neurally diverse audience is a challenge. Like, do you work with neurodiversity on this scale?
So we haven't had the opportunity to do so, although we were involved in a project working with the autism spectrum disorders people. So I think that when we're designing for people with disabilities, either psychiatric disabilities or sensory disabilities or motor disabilities, we're designing for everybody, actually. So we need to design for the neurodiversity, because by designing for people who have problems walking, you will design for kids and for elderly. By designing for people who have trouble processing noise, you will design for a lot of different types of people. So I have the feeling that we have to stop designing for some kind of persona that would be a 30-year-old guy in perfect health, and we have to really
It's the
design.
30-year-old 175 centimeters male European, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we have to design, we have to take into account people with disabilities, because if we design for them, we'll design for everybody. I think that I would be curious.
I mean, because this.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yes, I would be curious to see a counter example of that, actually. What would be designed for a person with a disability that wouldn't fit another person with no disability? I'm not sure there's plenty of examples.
Yeah, no, because I mean, this is like a very interesting topic because, for example, at some, I mean, everybody, like even like in the audience, you might be familiar with this. These photos you see sometimes in memes and or like the sounds, and then they say, "Is this dress blue or black?" And then some people see it black, some people see it blue, and then apparently the same for hearing. Some people hear some frequencies and some people don't, and then like all this topic is really dependent on how old you are and then how healthy your neural system is in a way. But then there's another topic which I'm interested in very much. Maybe we can just like have what do you think about this, because we see a lot of like neural augmentation using neurotechnology within these environments. So there are a lot of people who can now sense new things because we know that what we experience is limited to our input data that we're getting. So we cannot see all colors that other animals see. We cannot listen to all sounds. But then some people are playing with this and adding some sensory devices to their bodies to play with this. I'm really interested in this, and then because I'm more interested in the playing part than in the purely scientific part. So just like playing around with this. I mean, I would really like to know, because when we were talking, I was always thinking like doing urbanism for the brain in a way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like it's mainly trying to design. I mean, because then like when we design environments for a healthier brain, then that's for you what is a healthy environment, right?
Yes, I agree.
Great. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what I have in my bag. Anybody in the audience has any questions or comments? Because some people were saying here, Irina, hello. Irina was just confirming your theory on nature.
Yes, she's added some information that I think that I agree that of course we're biological organisms, but still we know that our brain processes natural information or nature related information in a kind of unique way, because as Irina is saying, we know that having just being able to see some trees by the windows will have beneficial impact on the acoustic comfort in your house, for instance, but also on well-being. Now they show that just putting a poster with a tree is going to help you concentrate better than if it's a poster with geometric shapes, for instance. There are studies showing that if you put green in hospital, people heal better and quicker. And all of this for me is an argument for what I was saying earlier, is that our brain has adapted into natural environments. And those kind of information are the information he knows how to process, and it processes them easily. And green is related to nature and related to those kind of natural statistics, as they say in paper, showing those kind of effect. So all the natural statistics, and it could be curvature. We know also that our eye is and our visual regions are adapted to process curvature and not angular shapes, because the curvature is more frequent in nature than angular shapes. So that's the same kind of reasoning, the same line of reasoning, sorry. Our brain is better suited to process more natural environments than very urbanized environments. Today it's the case, maybe it will change, but
Yeah. So like I have just two more questions. I'll try to be as quick as possible. One thing is, I think in urban environments, safety is usually a very big issue, but it's less safety and more like feeling safe in an urban environment. So maybe you can tell us a bit about that as well.
Yes, and I think it's a really interesting question because feelings of safety can for sure be correlated to safety, objective safety, but can be completely not anti-correlated, but not correlated at all. For instance, we know that if you compare the same urban environment through the eye of a woman or a man, there's a systematic effect of the feeling of safety with women feeling less safe in the same urban environment than men. So for instance, those data are really important to take into account because if you just if you study the perception of one type of population or one gender, you will have a result that is completely different to the results of another gender. So for instance, we have this big effect of gender on the feelings of safety. And we know that feeling of safety can depend on, for instance, there are studies showing that if you have many doors on, if you take a 100-meter facade and you vary the number of doors, meaning the number of people living behind those doors, the feelings of safety will be modulated as well. If you have a street canopy with trees, you will have a feeling of safety that is increased compared that when you have trees that don't form a canopy, a protecting space. So there are lots of results that can help better understanding how we can create safer, not safer, objectively safer, but subjectively safer urban environments. And I think it's a very important issue as well. We have to stop building buildings that have those mirror facades, you know, where you cannot see inside those, because still that's another, there are data showing that if you can see there are people inside the building, then it can I mean the other way around, if you can see that there's life behind the windows, it can increase the feeling of safety compared that when you have just mirror facade.
Yeah, actually, this is one point Anne Sussman was making, like in our previous NeuroTechDesign event, where she was evaluating the impact of having openings on facades on the brain activity of people. And then actually one of her experiments was asking a question, which is, where would you leave your kid, next to this building or that building? And then people were mainly choosing one building based on having an opening that they can see through inside. And then what she's doing is she's doing this using some biometrics and mainly tracking the eyes of where people are looking at.
Yes, and you have those. I don't know if you know this Jane Jacobs book called The Eyes on the Street. Yeah, there's a sense of social surveillance. If you know there are eyes on the street, and if there are no eyes on the street, if people, if you cannot see people or people cannot see you, or if the streets are completely empty, or if now it's becoming more and more frequent, we are losing in some neighborhood what you call activated, how do you say that in English? You have shops on the ground floor and I
How
don't
is
know.
it in French?
Rez-de-chaussée activé, or when you have shops and
yeah, it's like an activated ground space.
Yeah, activated
floor,
ground space. In some neighborhoods that are getting more and more residential, you are losing those kind of activated ground space, as you say, and that's not
floors, whatever. Yeah.
So there are lots of stuff that we have to pay attention to, and that will impact the feeling of safety, or yeah.
Super. Yeah, because this is one thing that always reoccurs in a lot of urban data, like studies or data mapping or analysis, which is like, where do people feel safe in cities? And I think this is something that's really important we can quantify here.
I agree. And even with the COVID, at some point the streets were really empty, and we would feel a bit unsafe. I'm living in central Paris, and I've never felt any fear walking in my neighborhood by night. And during the lockdown, I was feeling unsafe during the day in the neighborhood where I live, and that's because there were no eyes on the streets. I'm sure.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Great, thank you. Okay, yeah. Great. So yeah, I think that was our webinar. Anybody has any last comments before we just wrap up? Let me check the comments here on YouTube. So I think we're good. I mean, anybody who is here or who'd like to join afterwards would be, oh, we have one question here. What could be the drivers for implementing such better informed urban design? And is it limited to separated niche projects here and there, or could it be developed to be sort of a new dominant design process? I can try to rephrase this for you because I'm reading it from the YouTube questions. So the main question is that, is this workflow or process mainly limited to some like niche projects which we just apply in small situations, or can it be a more dominant design workflow?
I think it will be a more dominant way of designing cities when we'll have enough evidence to show that it's worth integrating those science. For now, I think the clients we're working with are really people looking for innovation. So I would say it's still a niche, but as people working on the environmental impact are now typical actors of urban projects, quantifying the environmental impact and all those kind of things. I'm sure we can have people like you and me now working in the same type of projects and evaluating the human impact or the behavioral impact. And I'm sure that it should become more widespread. But I have to say, from my point of view, in France, it's still a niche, yes, but I would be happy that if it's become a more dominant point of view, because I'm really convinced that if we are looking at the problem through many angles, that's how we're going to create a successful and sustainable urban environments.
Yeah. I don't know if the person asking this was meaningless, but anyway, I think it's important to point out that what's happening in Paris now is more like tactical urbanism, which actually facilitates a lot of the work which is of this type, because then you can work on point projects, but on a very strategic vision, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's what I feel personally, because like the way tactical urbanism works allows a lot of this work in research.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it allows experimentation, and I think experimentation is a big part of applying science to to urban projects. We have to experiment. We have to test interventions on the field. Perfect. So actually, we crossed our time. I'll need to wrap up now. So yeah, that was it. Everybody who was not here or would like to see us afterwards, it's going to be on YouTube. The meetup event is going to be there. So anybody here who has questions later can just drop them down in the meetup page. And then, I mean, whenever you draw something there, everybody's going to see it because they give you a notification. And then maybe we can have a conversation over there sometime. Besides that, thanks a lot, Emma, for the presentation and for being here. Thanks, everybody, for joining as well. Thanks for all your questions you asked, and thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if that was a bit too much, no, but like this is something that I'm really interested in and have a lot of questions to ask about, because I think these are questions that I mean can really benefit people who are entering this domain. I have a lot of friends who work in design. They get interested in these topics, but it seems a bit blurry for them. So I think this is the kind of questions that could be helpful, because these are the kind of questions I wish I knew when I started working there. Great, I was glad to discuss it with you.
So yeah, thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, everyone.